The forest was quiet, save for the soft whispers of the wind threading through the trees. Snow lay thick on the ground, its untouched surface glowing faintly beneath the pale light of the winter moon. Each step from the lone traveler crunched sharply in the silence, the sound louder than it should have been. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, the cold creeping through the fabric like icy fingers. Around her, the darkened forest seemed to lean in, the branches stretching low with the weight of snow, casting strange, twisting shadows. The trees, so familiar to her, now seemed different, as if they had shifted in the night, becoming something foreign. Her breath formed little clouds in the frigid air, a stark contrast to the stillness that surrounded her. It was then that she saw it. A faint, golden light flickered ahead, shimmering between the trees. At first, she thought it was the reflection of a distant star, but as she walked closer, it grew brighter, more tangible. The path narrowed, the trees bowing even further, creating an arch over her head. And there it was, glowing against the dark canvas of the woods, a small clearing, its center filled with webs of shimmering gold and silver. The threads caught the light, casting iridescent reflections across the snow. They hung in delicate patterns, stretching from one tree to another, like an intricate, frozen tapestry. A strange sense of wonder bloomed in her chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by unease. Something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, thick with a peculiar, almost suffocating sweetness, like honey mixed with something darker. Her senses tingled, as if the webs themselves were watching her, waiting. And then she saw the movement. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, just a slight shift in the webs, a tremor that rippled through the threads. But it was enough. Her heart skipped, a shiver running through her entire body. Her feet, frozen in place, wouldn't allow her to turn away. And then she heard it, a soft, melodic hum, rising from somewhere within the webs. It was both beautiful and chilling, like the song of something that should not exist. She blinked, as if to clear her mind, but when her eyes returned to the webs, they seemed to have changed. The golden threads pulsed with a life of their own, twisting and shifting, as if they were alive. The cold seemed to intensify, the air thickening around her chest. And with every beat of the strange melody, the webs seemed to grow, expanding outward, stretching ever closer toward her. Her breath quickened, the air growing colder still, biting into her lungs as she tried to move, but her feet remained stuck in place, rooted to the frozen ground. The hum grew louder, vibrating through her bones now, a strange pulse that resonated deep within her. The golden threads shimmered with an almost unnatural brilliance, their glow flickering in time with the haunting melody. She couldn't look away. The webs began to twitch, as if something within them was stirring. For a moment, there was a silence, an eerie stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, a figure emerged from the depths of the shimmering strands. At first, she thought it was a shadow, just a trick of the light, but no, a tall, slender figure, wrapped in the very same golden and silver webs, stepped forward. Its face was obscured by a delicate mask of glimmering threads, yet she could feel its eyes on her, cold, penetrating, as if it could see right through her. A chill ran down her spine. The figure moved with an unsettling grace, each step slow and deliberate, the webbing that clung to its form shifting like liquid light. Her heart raced as it drew nearer, its every movement like the flutter of an unseen breeze. And then, as if in response to her thoughts, the figure tilted its head ever so slightly. A shiver rippled through her as the melody grew stronger, now unmistakably a voice, soft, sweet, yet filled with an unsettling hunger. The words were indecipherable at first, a language that didn't belong to this world. But as the figure reached out, extending a hand toward her, she understood. The words were an invitation. Come closer. She could feel it now, the weight of the invitation pressing against her, pulling her towards the figure, to the very heart of the glowing web. Her body moved against her will, each step drawn in by the insistent call. But as her foot lifted, she caught sight of something in the corner of her eye, another shadow, faint and fleeting, yet unmistakably there. Something or someone watching from the edges of the clearing. It was enough to break the spell. Her feet froze once again, and she turned to face the new presence, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked back, the figure was gone, vanished into the shimmering webs as if it had never been there at all. The clearing was empty now, save for the gently swaying webs, their golden threads swaying in the wind. She stood there for a moment, the silence almost deafening, before the realization hit her. The webs were closing in. They stretched, creeping toward her from all directions, as if the clearing itself had become a trap. Her pulse raced, fear gripping her chest as she turned to flee, but the snow crunched beneath her feet, louder now, as if the ground itself was warning her, urging her to stop. And then she heard it again, soft, melodic, the hum rising once more. But this time, it wasn't just from the webs. It was all around her, a whispering, coiling sound, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, drawing closer. And she knew, with sickening certainty, that she wasn't alone anymore. Her heart hammered in her chest as she spun, desperately searching the shadows, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The golden threads of the webs were now twisting toward her, each movement deliberate, slow, like the approach of something inevitable. The humming grew louder, more insistent, as though it was no longer coming from just one source, but from all around her, wrapping around her mind like a tightening coil. She tried to move, to run, but her legs were heavy, as if the snow beneath her had turned to quicksand. The trees seemed to grow taller, their dark branches reaching toward her, their skeletal fingers brushing the air, closing in like an unholy circle. The webs gleamed brighter now, reflecting the faintest light as they stretched further, twisting and turning, as though alive with some terrible purpose. She could feel their presence, pressing against her, moving faster, closing the gap between her and the endless night of the forest. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw them, shapes, emerging from the shadows. Figures, just like the one that had appeared before, wrapped in threads of gold and silver, their faces hidden beneath shimmering masks. They moved in perfect unison, their steps echoing the rhythmic hum, a symphony of haunting motions. The trees seemed to grow taller, their dark branches reaching toward her, their skeletal fingers brushing the air, closing in like an unholy circle. The webs gleamed brighter now, reflecting the faintest light as they stretched further, twisting and turning, as though alive with some terrible purpose. She could feel their presence, pressing against her, moving faster, closing the gap between her and the endless night of the forest. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw them, shapes, emerging from the shadows. Figures, just like the one that had appeared before, wrapped in threads of gold and silver, their faces hidden beneath shimmering masks. They moved in perfect unison, their steps echoing the rhythmic hum, a symphony of haunting motions. One of them reached out a long, bony hand, thin as the threads it was wrapped in, and touched her arm. The cold that surged through her at the contact was more than just temperature. It was as if the touch reached inside her, touching something deep within, something ancient and forgotten. Her breath caught, her pulse thudding in her ears as a voice, barely a whisper, coiled into her mind. "Come, join us." The words slid into her thoughts, as if they weren't spoken, but simply known, a truth that had always been there, hidden behind the veil of the ordinary world. Her mind screamed to break free, to run, but her body was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure's hand was cold, colder than the bitterest winter, yet it burned with something far worse than mere frostbite. A tremor shook her entire being, and she tried to wrench herself free, but the webs were everywhere now, clinging to her, tightening around her arms, her legs, her neck. It wasn't just the figure anymore. The entire clearing, the entire forest, seemed alive, thrumming with energy. The golden threads twisted and wove tighter, encircling her in a cocoon of shimmering light. She felt it then, the shift in the air. A rush of cold so deep, so ancient, it made her teeth ache. The webs closed around her like a snare, drawing her in closer, until there was nothing left of her but the cold, the humming, and the oppressive dark. And just as her vision blurred, as the world around her melted into nothingness, she saw it at the heart of the clearing. A singular, glimmering thread, thick as a rope, pulsing with a rhythm that felt like the beating of her own heart. She knew, with terrifying clarity, that it was pulling her toward it. Not with force, but with an invitation. An invitation to become part of something far older than the world itself. And as her body grew heavier, the golden threads tightening around her, she realized there was no escape. No escape from the webs of gold and silver, from the song that had drawn her in, from the cold that was consuming her. She was part of the forest now. And it was only a matter of time before she would become just another thread in its intricate, shimmering tapestry. The hum of the golden threads vibrated through her body now, each pulse sending a shockwave through her veins, cold and electric. Her mind screamed to break free, but it was as if her thoughts themselves were being swallowed by the web, each passing second erasing the sense of who she was. The golden threads, once delicate and beautiful, now felt suffocating, pulling tighter around her, suffusing her skin with a cold, unnatural chill. Her breath was shallow, but the web held her fast, its intricate strands like the fingers of some unseen giant, closing in on her very essence. She tried to cry out, but the sound was swallowed, absorbed by the shimmering threads. And then, just as her vision began to fade, a sharp, jarring sensation seized her chest, like a hand gripping her heart. A single thought pierced the fog of her mind, Who is in control now? The question echoed through her like a distant whisper, and for the first time since she entered the clearing, she felt something different. Something was wrong, more wrong than it had been before. Her senses returned, albeit sluggishly, as the shadows around her flickered, and the hum of the web seemed to shift into something darker. A new presence, more distinct than the others, emerged from the corner of her vision. A shadow, taller, more imposing, moving with deliberate grace. Her heart pounded louder now, each beat hammering in her chest as her mind strained to comprehend what was happening. The shadows seemed to dissolve into the web, its form merging with the threads themselves. She felt its presence inside her, cold and intrusive, as if it had wrapped itself into her very soul, latching onto her being. A cold laugh, soft but clear, rang out from the shadows. It was the same melody, only this time it was sharper, tinged with a cruel edge. Her body trembled, and the web, as if feeding off her fear, tightened even further, constricting her chest, her limbs, until it felt like her very bones were being crushed beneath its weight. The shadow drew closer, now unmistakably a figure, tall and cloaked in the same shimmering gold and silver. Its face was hidden, but she could feel its gaze upon her, like burning eyes that pierced the very core of her being. The figure reached out, a hand extending toward her, the threads wrapping around its fingers like silk. It was no longer an invitation, it was a demand. "Join us," the voice whispered, not in words, but in her thoughts. "Become one with the thread. Become part of the story." A terrible realization struck her. This was no ordinary clearing, no simple forest. This place was a net, a trap woven from the very fabric of fate itself. The figure before her was the master of this place, a keeper of the web, a creature older than the forest, older than the world. It wasn't just inviting her, it was claiming her. And with that understanding, the final strands of resistance within her began to unravel. Her limbs grew heavy, her vision darkened, and the cold tightened its grip on her heart. She no longer had control. The web had won. And in that moment, she understood the true horror of the clearing. It wasn't just the shimmering golden threads that held her captive. It was the fate of all who had ever wandered into this forest, lost souls, forever entwined in the web of gold and silver, their stories consumed by the endless hum. The darkness closed in around her, and as she took her final breath, her essence merged with the tapestry. She was part of it now forever. A new thread in the eternal web of the forest. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the cold pressed in from every angle, suffocating her very thoughts. She was no longer aware of her own body, her limbs, her chest, her breath. All had become distant echoes, like whispers from a forgotten dream. The golden threads tightened around her, drawing her deeper into the heart of the web, but there was no pain, no fear. There was only the suffocating embrace of the forest. And then, nothing. A hollow, endless silence settled over her mind. The webs shimmered with an eerie light, but there was no longer any sense of time, no ticking of the clock. In this place, time was irrelevant. The very concept of it seemed to dissolve, as if the moments themselves were caught in the eternal shimmer of the web. And then, something strange happened. A distant sound, faint at first, like a breath on the wind. It was a whisper, soft but clear, like the rustle of leaves in the deepest forest. She couldn't make out the words, but they felt familiar, as if they came from somewhere deep within her, from the depths of the web itself. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, until the words formed in her mind. "Wake up!" Her chest tightened, her breath quickened, as if something had just been unlocked, an opening, a fracture in the web's hold on her. The voice grew stronger. "Wake up before it's too late." Her body stirred, and with it, the weight of the web began to loosen, just slightly, as though it were unraveling. For the first time since she had entered the clearing, she could feel the sensation of her own body again, the cold air against her skin, the weight of her feet on the snow. It was like being born again, pulled from the depths of a nightmare and back into the waking world. The golden threads were still around her, but they no longer felt suffocating. They felt fragile. With every passing second, they seemed to lose their grip, unraveling, flickering like dying embers. She could move now, slowly at first, but her limbs were becoming her own again. Her breath, shallow and ragged, filled her lungs, and the world around her shifted, no longer dark, no longer closed in. She was free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she stepped forward, the snow beneath her feet crunching with every movement. The web stretched out before her, shimmering and fading into the distance, like threads of a dream she could no longer grasp. And behind her, the clearing was empty. The figures, the presence, the hum, they were all gone. She was alone in the forest again. But this time, there was no golden glow, no invitation to join the web. The clearing was just a clearing, a quiet, empty space in the woods. The forest had released her. But as she stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that the web was still there, watching her from the shadows. Waiting. The hum of the forest, once so distant, was now a faint echo at the edges of her consciousness, always there, just beyond the reach of her awareness. And she knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Not yet. The web was always watching, always waiting for the next thread to wander too close. And no one ever truly escapes the forest. Not really. Not forever. Not entirely. The forest was eerily silent now, the only sound the soft crunch of her boots against the snow as she walked deeper into its depths. She had thought she was free. The chill in the air felt somehow less oppressive, and the moonlight filtered through the trees in gentle, silver beams. But something had changed in her, something deep, something hidden. The weight of the web still lingered in her chest, a phantom presence that she couldn't shake. Her thoughts drifted back to the clearing, to the threads that had nearly consumed her. A part of her wondered if it had all been some twisted dream. But then she caught sight of something. A faint shimmer, far off through the trees, barely visible, like a flicker of golden light in the distance. It was barely noticeable at first, but the moment her eyes locked onto it, it seemed to pulse slow and deliberate, like the beat of a heart. Her pulse quickened. That same golden glow, the same color as the web, the same warmth was calling to her again. The air grew thick, the snow beneath her feet suddenly feeling heavier, as if the ground itself was dragging her toward it. She fought the urge to move closer, to step into the light. but it was almost impossible to resist. With every step, the light grew stronger, more vivid, as though it was pulling her in, wrapping her up in an invisible thread. It wasn't the forest anymore. It wasn't the trees or the snow or the moonlit sky. It was the web, and it was waiting. Her breath hitched in her throat as the pull intensified. She was helpless against it. As she neared the source of the light, she realized that it was not just a flicker, not just a distant glow. It was alive. The shimmering strands were suspended in midair, hanging like a veil, as delicate and as fragile as spider silk, but pulsing with a strange, almost magnetic force. And there, at the heart of it, stood the figure once again. The same one she had seen in the clearing, its face still hidden behind the golden mask, its form wrapped tightly in the glowing threads of the forest. It didn't move, didn't speak, but she could feel its gaze on her, penetrating, knowing. A shiver ran down her spine. The golden light flickered, the threads shifting in response to her presence, stretching ever so slightly toward her, as though acknowledging her return. A soft voice, no longer the haunting melody, whispered in her mind. "You thought you escaped." Her breath caught in her throat. "You never leave. You belong to the forest now. We all do." She stumbled back, her legs unsteady as the weight of its words sank deep into her heart. No, she thought. She had been released. She had to be free. But then, the light pulsed again, stronger this time, sending a wave of warmth through her chest, making her heart race, as though the very air was alive. And as the figure stepped forward, the golden threads closing in around her once again, she realized with a terrible certainty that the forest's grip had never loosened. It had only been waiting for her to come back. And now it was time to become part of the web again. Her vision blurred, and the threads wrapped tighter, engulfing her in their shimmering embrace. The hum filled her mind once more, a deep, resonant sound, like the pulse of the earth itself. And the forest whispered, with all its ancient, endless hunger, "You're ours now." The threads tightened around her, their golden glow now blinding, suffocating. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat growing weaker as the warmth of the forest seeped into her very bones. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, as if the entire world had become compressed into a single, unyielding point. Her thoughts began to scatter, pulled apart by the force of the web. The threads whispered to her, soothing, coaxing, as they wound around her like a lover's embrace, promising no more fear, no more pain, only belonging. Her body felt distant, as though it were no longer her own. It was as if her very essence was being absorbed into the shimmering gold, woven into its infinite strands, becoming part of the forest itself. The web, once so beautiful and delicate, was now a prison, wrapping around her mind and soul, binding her to the ancient hunger of the forest. She tried to fight it, tried to scream, tried to break free, but it was futile. The golden threads filled her senses, drowning out all other thoughts. There was no escape from the forest's call. Her limbs went limp, and the cold, familiar weight of the web settled around her chest, binding her tightly, pulling her into the heart of the dark, tangled mass. She was a thread now, one of many. In that final moment, A single thought flickered through her mind, a fleeting whisper of something she had forgotten long ago. The question, as fragile as a dying ember, burned briefly before being consumed by the suffocating darkness. And with that, the forest claimed her, silent, patient, inevitable. The web stretched out into the night, endless, timeless, its golden threads gleaming in the moonlight as they wove new stories, new souls, into its intricate tapestry. And far beneath the surface of the earth, in the depths where only the oldest shadows stirred, the forest hummed its eternal lullaby, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its grasp. The forest was still, untouched by time. The golden threads glimmered softly, now carrying the weight of countless souls, each thread a life, a story, a memory. And though the clearing had long since returned to its quiet, snow-covered state, a subtle shift had occurred. For each person, every soul, that became part of the web, something new was added to the hum of the forest. A new thread, a new voice, joined the endless chorus. And as the wind whispered through the trees, the forest sighed in contentment, its hunger sated for now. But it would never sleep. It was always waiting. Waiting for the next curious traveler, the next lost wanderer, the next soul drawn by the golden glow, by the sweet, haunting melody. The web stretched ever outward, reaching into the deepest corners of the world, its threads invisible, but always there, pulling, weaving, waiting for the moment when someone would step into its embrace. The forest had claimed another, but its appetite was endless. And no one was ever truly free. Not for long. The hum of the forest, the soft, insistent call of the web, would always draw them back, whether they realized it or not. Because the forest and the web was not just a place. It was a hunger, an ancient, eternal hunger. And once you were caught, you were never truly gone. Only waiting. Waiting to become a part of the next story. A part of the next thread. The forest stood silent under the weight of the moonlight, its stillness deceptive, hiding the ever-watchful, all-encompassing presence that lingered just beneath the surface. The golden threads, invisible to the naked eye yet ever present in the depth of the trees, seemed to pulse with a quiet, insistent energy. They swayed in response to the faintest breeze, reaching out, searching for something, anything, that would step too close, that would wander too far into the forest's embrace. Though the forest appeared calm, it never truly rested. The hum of the web was constant, a subtle vibration in the air, barely perceptible, but it was there, always waiting. And within the forest, deep in its heart, the forest knew who would come next. It always knew. The golden threads shifted once again, flickering in the dark as though they had sensed something, a subtle change in the air, a crack in the silence. Far off, at the edge of the trees, a figure moved cautiously through the snow. A traveler, lost just as the others had been, drawn to the forest by something ancient, something beyond comprehension. The figure moved forward, their steps hesitant, unsure, unaware of the invisible threads that stretched silently toward them. They were too close now. The hum began to rise, a soft undertone at first, but slowly gaining strength, a whisper in the air. The figure froze, their senses suddenly heightened, their skin prickling with the unmistakable feeling that they were not alone. A shadow flickered in the corner of their vision, something shifting among the trees. They turned, their heart pounding, but there was nothing. Nothing but the snow, the dark woods, the distant call of owls in the night. The figure hesitated again, glancing behind them. Perhaps it had been nothing. But then the air grew heavier, colder. The silence deepened, stretching, pressing in on them from all sides. The hum grew louder, clearer now, an undeniable presence, an invitation, a command. The figure took another step, unknowingly stepping closer to the golden threads, the pulsing heart of the forest. And somewhere, deep in the tangled web, the hum became a voice, a whisper in the dark. "Welcome." The figure stilled, their breath catching in their throat, the word echoing in their mind. The golden threads shimmered, alive once again, stretching toward the figure, their pull irresistible, an unspoken promise. They were waiting. The forest was always waiting. And just as the figure's foot fell upon the frozen ground, the threads closed in, silent but swift, wrapping around their ankles, their wrists, pulling them into the waiting dark. The forest had claimed another. And somewhere, in the infinite web, another thread was woven into the intricate pattern. Another soul was lost, caught in the endless hunger of the forest. For the web never stopped, never ceased its call. It was always waiting for the next lost traveler, the next soul to wander too close. And the cycle would begin again. The forest was still, its quiet beauty now an unsettling silence. The moon hung low, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air, once crisp and sharp, now felt thick, heavy, with the weight of something unseen. The hum of the golden threads vibrated, though no one could see them. It pulsed through the air, an energy that could be felt in the bones, in the soul, if one was attuned to its call. It was an invitation, a lure, and the forest was always waiting. Somewhere, deep within the labyrinth of trees, where the moonlight never touched, a figure walked. Their steps were slow, almost cautious, as if they were aware, on some primal level, that something was wrong. Yet, they could not stop themselves, not now. They had already crossed the threshold, drawn into the forest by forces they could not comprehend. With every step, they felt the weight of the web press in closer, the subtle tugging of the threads at the edges of their mind, at the edges of their heart. There was no turning back now. The forest had already claimed them. The air grew colder, and the snow beneath their feet crunched softly, but it was not the sound of the world that filled their ears. It was the hum, the low, constant hum of the golden threads, vibrating through the very ground, through their very being. They stopped, standing still in the heart of the forest, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The threads shimmered into view, delicate and beautiful, their golden sheen glistening in the pale light. They reached toward the figure, as if sensing their presence, as if they had been waiting for this very moment. The threads, like tendrils, wrapped around their ankles, their wrists, pulling them in with a gentle but undeniable force. The figure tried to pull away, but the threads tightened, each one sinking deeper into their skin, into their soul, until they were no longer separate, no longer an individual. They were part of the web now, a part of the forest. And as they felt themselves being consumed by the shimmering threads, the last thought they had was not of fear, but of understanding. They were not the first, and they would not be the last. For in the heart of the forest, the web was always waiting, always hungry, and those who wandered too close would never escape. They were all part of the same, eternal story. The forest was quiet once again, its stillness broken only by the soft murmur of wind through the branches. The moon, now high in the sky, bathed the snow-covered ground in pale light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Beneath the trees, the golden threads shimmered faintly, invisible to the casual observer, but ever present in the fabric of the world. The hum had faded, as though it were nothing more than a distant memory, a whisper carried off by the wind. Yet, in the deepest parts of the woods, where no light dared enter, the web waited, silent, eternal, patient. It had claimed another, just as it always did. And as the forest settled into its familiar rhythm, there was no sign of the traveler who had wandered too far. No trace of their footsteps in the snow. They had become one with the web, woven into its intricate tapestry, their soul absorbed into the endless hum. Time moved on, as it always does. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. Seasons shifted, but the forest remained unchanged, its hunger unyielding. And those who had come before, lost in the golden web, were not forgotten. Their stories lingered in the soft murmur of the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, in the endless song of the forest. The travelers who had been claimed by the web, their lives woven into its fabric, were now part of something greater. Their presence remained, intertwined with the lives of others who would come, who would stumble into the web's grasp, unknowingly drawn by its golden lure. In the end, the forest did not consume, it absorbed, it collected. It gathered the stories, the souls, and the memories, and in doing so, it became something more. Something timeless. Something eternal. And as the golden threads stretched ever outward, weaving new paths, new lives, the forest remained, waiting, always waiting for the next wanderer, for the next soul who would find themselves lost in the web of gold and silver. For the forest had no end, no conclusion. Only endless beginnings.